There are moments in history when the truth becomes impossible to hide. Not during the conflict itself, not while governments are issuing statements, television networks are chasing headlines, and political leaders are trying to control the narrative. The truth usually arrives later. It arrives when the smoke begins to clear, when the economic damage becomes measurable, when the strategic consequences can no longer be dismissed as temporary setbacks, and when nations are finally forced to confront the cost of decisions that once seemed politically convenient. That is where the United States finds itself in the summer of 2026. After months of escalating conflict involving Iran, Israel, and the United States, a fragile ceasefire is now taking shape. The Strait of Hormuz is beginning to reopen. Negotiations are underway. Regional governments are attempting to stabilize markets and prevent a wider catastrophe. But beneath those developments lies a much larger question. How did America reach a point where its foreign policy became so deeply entangled in the ambitions of leaders abroad that major military decisions appeared disconnected from the interests of ordinary Americans? That question is now becoming impossible to ignore. And at the center of that debate stands one man whose influence has shaped Middle Eastern politics for decades, Benjamin Netanyahu. For nearly 30 years, Netanyahu has been one of the defining figures in Israeli politics. His political career has stretched across multiple generations of American presidents and multiple eras of global diplomacy. When he first became prime minister in the 1990s, the Middle East looked dramatically different than it does today. The Oslo peace process still existed. Iran's nuclear program had not yet become one of the world's most contentious security issues. Hezbollah was far less powerful than it is now. The region had not yet been transformed by the wars in Iraq and Syria, and the international system still maintained at least some confidence in diplomacy as a mechanism for resolving major conflicts. 3 decades later, many of those assumptions have disappeared. The Middle East has experienced repeated cycles of war, instability, and geopolitical competition. And throughout much of that period, Netanyahu remained one of the most influential voices shaping Israel's strategic direction. Supporters view him as a leader who protected Israel during some of the most dangerous periods in its history. Critics argue that his policies contributed to regional instability, deepened conflicts with neighboring populations, and repeatedly increased tensions with Iran. Regardless of which perspective one adopts, few would dispute that Netanyahu's influence has been extraordinary, which makes the current moment all the more remarkable. Because the most surprising development of 2026 may not be the ceasefire itself, and may be the growing public distance between Netanyahu and President Donald Trump. For years, Trump and Netanyahu appeared politically aligned on many of the most consequential issues facing the region. Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement negotiated during the Obama administration. Each decision was celebrated by Netanyahu's government as a major strategic victory. The relationship appeared stronger than ever. Yet today, signs of strain are becoming increasingly visible. Reports from diplomatic circles suggest that frustration has grown inside the Trump administration regarding the costs and consequences of the recent conflict with Iran. And that frustration is not difficult to understand. The war produced economic disruptions that extended far beyond the Middle East. The temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz sent shockwaves to global energy markets. Shipping routes were disrupted, insurance costs surged, commodity prices climbed. Governments across Europe, Asia, and the developing world faced economic consequences from a conflict in which they had little direct involvement. For many countries, the message was simple. The world economy could not absorb another prolonged regional war. At the same time, public opinion inside the United States showed increasing fatigue with overseas military engagements. After decades of interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, many Americans have become deeply skeptical of military campaigns that lack clearly defined objectives and exit strategies. That skepticism became particularly relevant when discussions turned toward Iran. Iran is not a small regional actor. It is a nation of more than 90 million people. It possesses significant military capabilities, extensive missile programs, and a deeply rooted sense of national identity shaped by centuries of history. Any attempt to fundamentally reshape Iran through military force would inevitably involve enormous risks. Military planners understand this, strategists understand this, and increasingly voters understand it as well. As the conflict expanded earlier this year, many Americans began asking a straightforward question: what exactly is the end goal? If the objective was preventing nuclear escalation, diplomacy offered one path. If the objective was regional deterrence, military pressure offered another. But if the objective became something larger, such as transforming Iran's political system, the challenges multiplied dramatically. History offers numerous examples of how difficult regime change strategies can become once military operations begin. That reality appears to have influenced political calculations in Washington. Because whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, one characteristic has remained consistent throughout his political career. He pays close attention to political risk. When support begins shifting, he notices. When public opinion changes, he adapts. And when a policy threatens his broader political position, he often recalibrates quickly. That appears to be happening now. The ceasefire framework currently being discussed includes multiple stages: the reopening of shipping routes, further negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear activities, potential economic measures aimed at reducing tensions, and discussions surrounding frozen Iranian financial assets held under various sanctions mechanisms. None of these issues will be easy to resolve. Each carries enormous political implications for every government involved. Iran must demonstrate strength to its domestic audience. Israel must maintain a security posture. The United States must convince voters that its strategy achieved meaningful results. And regional powers must ensure that the conflict does not reignite. That is an extraordinarily difficult balancing act. Meanwhile, the political landscape inside Israel remains highly volatile. Netanyahu faces pressure from rivals who argue that current policies have not gone far enough. Others believe the recent conflict has imposed unacceptable costs on Israel's economy, international reputation, and long-term security. The result is a political environment where consensus remains elusive. Even if the ceasefire survives, deeper disagreements remain unresolved. That uncertainty raises another critical question. Can the United States sustain a long-term strategic shift if one is truly underway? Historically, American foreign policy has often moved in cycles. Military interventions generate backlash. Backlash produces calls for restraint. Restraint eventually gives way to new security concerns, and the cycle begins again. Breaking that pattern has proven extraordinarily difficult. Powerful interests, long-standing alliances, and institutional habits frequently pull policy back toward familiar approaches. That is why the current moment deserves attention, not because it guarantees transformation, but because it creates the possibility of transformation. For the first time in years, major political figures across multiple countries are openly debating assumptions that previously seemed untouchable. Questions about military intervention, questions about alliance management, questions about economic sanctions, questions about the relationship between American interests and regional conflicts. Those conversations are no longer confined to academic conferences or policy journals. They are taking place in public, and that alone represents a significant change. Still, it would be premature to declare a new era. The ceasefire remains fragile. Negotiations could collapse. Regional tensions remain high, and every major player retains incentives that could complicate the diplomatic process. History rarely moves in a straight line. Progress is often uneven. Setbacks are common, and moments that appear transformational sometimes fade into little more than temporary pauses. Yet something important has undeniably changed. The Strait of Hormuz is reopening. Diplomats are talking instead of exchanging threats. Financial markets are beginning to stabilize. And political leaders who once appeared united are now showing visible signs of disagreement. Whether that leads to lasting peace remains uncertain. Whether it produces a more sustainable regional order remains unknown. But after months of escalating confrontation, the world has at least stepped back from a dangerous edge. And in international politics, that can matter more than many people realize. Because before lasting solutions become possible, escalation must stop. Before diplomacy can succeed, violence must slow. And before nations can rebuild trust, they must first decide that endless conflict is no longer acceptable. That decision may still be far away. But for now, the ships are moving again. The negotiations continue, and the future of the Middle East remains unwritten.